So I remember having a reading from an astrologer when I first started to become interested in astrology and started to dip my toe into learning it a little bit. And he read my chart. It was really good, read my chart more from like a personality perspective, like looking at the archetypes and saying, Saturn and Cancer. And so you're deeply emotional, right? And so he would read it from almost like a psychological or like a character trait based perspective. And like I said, it was really good, but I remember being at the end of the reading or getting towards the end of the reading. And I remember seeing some of my planets had the RX symbol next to them, so they were in retrograde. And I was like, hey, I'm like, well, what is the significance of these planets in retrograde? I see the little RX there. And he couldn't really answer. He didn't have an answer for it. It just wasn't part of the way that he learned astrology. That wasn't something that he paid attention to or interpreted. So I was like, huh. I'm like, well, astrology is symbolism, so it must mean something because my eyes are drawn to it. So obviously that I started continuing to learn astrology. And so I began to learn what that meant and then learned the EA or evolutionary astrology method of reading retrogrades. And I was like, yes, that resonates with me. So I felt that the natural video or the natural next video for me to make was on retrograde planets in your chart. And so that's what I'm doing here now. I'm gonna cover what it means. And so before I do that, the first thing I want to do is just a general overview, not too technical. What is retrograde? So I'm going to jump into that now. Okay, so I like this imagery. I found this on the internet, and this does a pretty good job of visually explaining what is it. And so if you go outside your door and you go to the night sky and you look at a planet that goes into retrograde motion, like let's just say, I think this actually is Mercury, right? So Mercury is the planet that most frequently goes into retrograde. And so if you went outside every night and you looked up and you located Mercury, you would see this path here, right? Like think of that as like each night going out, looking at the sky, and you see Mercury, and you're like, oh, well, it started over here and it's moving in this direction. And so you're tracking it night after night. And then it starts to slow down. In this area, it's still going, looking at the screen, it's still going from right to left, and it's still going in what we would call direct motion. But it seems like it's not, if you're tracking it, there's much more distance here than there is here, right? So you see that where you're locating it is getting closer and closer to the distance it was the night before. And then eventually it gets to this point over here and it appears like it stopped, right? Like if you look at these 3 points here or 3, 4, 5 points here, you see it's clustered and it appears like it stops. And so that's what we would call it stations retrograde, right? It looks like it's stopping in the sky. Then if you kept tracking this night after night, then you would see it starts going in reverse, which is the retrograde motion. And so it's going opposite of the way that you were tracking it here. And so if you have planets in your birth chart with an RX next to them, that signifies that it was in this pattern here. It appeared like it was going reverse. Now, planets don't actually go reverse. This is just when planets are orbiting the sun in relationship to the Earth orbiting the sun. Our view from our earthly perspective makes it look like these planets are going in reverse, right? But it's just from our point of view. And so in this section here is retrograde. And then again, it appears like it's slowing down and it's stopping. This part here would be indicative of being stationed direct. So station direct here, over here would be stationed retrograde. And then if you kept going outside and tracking it, you would see that it starts going forward again. Track it here, and you're like, okay, it's back on track again. It's going forward again. And so this is the pictorial of that motion and what it actually symbolizes in your chart. And so now let's jump into, okay, what the heck does this mean? What does the symbolism mean from an evolutionary astrology perspective? So a brief overview of retrograde, just a general overview. So as always, I've said this in other videos, or if I didn't say it, I thought it, is that frequency, perspective, and consciousness play a significant role. And what I mean by that is that what has your soul experienced, and what has your conditioning been, and what has the societal conditioning been, and what have your experiences been? All of that adds to how you experience these symbols in your chart. So it's not just retrograde, but any symbols in your chart that plays a significant role. And so I'm going to go on my little rant here about some astrology, or not some astrology. Like if when I studied Hellenistic astrology, there's a lot of interpretations in there, or significators for planets that are like, well, this planet's in its fall, or it's in its detriment, or it's in a bad place, or even it's exalted, or it's in a good place, or it's a benefic, or it's a malefic, right? And it's like, I don't subscribe to any of that. None of it. Like the good, the bad. I don't label any symbol in a chart good or bad. How do you experience it, right? Like an example would be, a Vedic astrologer one time was like, well, the sun is in Aquarius, so it's in detriment. And I'm like, what? I'm like, that no, that's not, no. Like if you tell somebody that, or that starts to become taught in that way, then yeah, then it's experienced in detriment. I'm like, but the sun in Aquarius is just the sun in the sign of Aquarius, period. It's an energy signature. And so I can interpret the sun in Aquarius, or I can be sitting in front of somebody that has the sun in Aquarius, and they could be brilliant, right? They're sun in Aquarius. They think outside of the box. They have these ideas that can move us forward in a positive direction in society, right? That's an interpretation, or a way that the sun in Aquarius can be experienced, right? So it's like, I don't subscribe to any of that. And so where was I going with this? Well, with the retrograde planets, with any planets really, but with retrograde, it's the same thing, right? It's like, how do you experience this retrograde motion, right? There's a frequency, which means you can experience it or interpret it as being really difficult, or you can experience it from the perspective of, no, I get it, and I know maybe some of the things that I went through are challenging, but I had to, because it was part of my soul's evolution, and I get it, right? So I've gained the wisdom from that, and now I express the energy of the planet in this way, which is in a completely different way, right? And so they're just symbols on a page, and how you experience them is how you experience them, and how you perceive experiencing them plays into your level of consciousness level, the level, your consciousness level. There's a lot of levels in there. It depends on how conscious and aware you are, and what's your perspective, right? And so somebody that is just going through life not aware of their multidimensionality, not aware that they're a part of source energy, not aware of a lot of things other than I'm taking this action and I'm getting this response, they may experience things as difficult, right? It's the universe's way of getting your attention is to give you feedback in terms of the action that you're taking. But if you're not seeing it from that perspective and you're just taking actions and it appears like the world is against you or things are happening to you, then yeah, that individual is going to experience this reality as difficult, right? That's how they're going to label it. Somebody else that's more aware, they understand their multidimensionality, maybe they use astrology, they're aware of metaphysics, they're aware of multidimensions, right? Somebody on that, from that perspective, they would have the same exact potential chart or the same signatures in their chart as somebody that experiences that energy as being extremely difficult. The more aware and conscious person would not, right? Or they would have some experiences that gave them direct feedback that could have been experienced as, yeah, that sucked, right? And it was difficult, but I understand there's a purpose in it and I'm going to grab the wisdom from that so that I'm even more conscious and aware moving forward. So my experience becomes lighter, it becomes more peaceful, it becomes more harmonious. And so that's super important when looking for me when at looking at anyone's chart is I don't know how you experience this until we actually sit together, right? And so from your perspective too, I mean, just with the fact that you're here and you're consuming this material and you're curious and you want to learn, you're probably experiencing this different. You are experiencing it different than anybody else, right? Period. But your consciousness level is probably to a level where you understand the bigger picture, right? So that when things are difficult, they're the universe's way of trying to orient you or get you to be aware of things you don't see within yourself or aware of your self-expression. It's helping. That's how it helps to keep moving you forward in your evolution. So back to the content. Retrograde is apparent motion, which I already covered in the beginning, so I won't continue with that. When you see retrograde planets, think of it as evolutionary acceleration and individuation. It's like I need to really focus on my uniqueness. I really need to focus internally to understand what I need to express, maybe what has happened in an individuated soul level in past lifetimes. Because we carry soul memory, right? So you think of Mercury, Mercury is the memory and the experiences we have in this reality. The symbol in your chart, Uranus, is like your soul carries the experiences that impact you in this lifetime, even if you're not consciously aware of it, right? So it's the individuated unconscious. And so that's what these RX symbols mean. They give you some more context in terms of maybe the unconscious stuff, which you can bring more to your conscious awareness to make this reality better, right? More peaceful, more harmonious, more collaborative, higher vibration, right? Which goes back to frequency. And so embracing all of who you are is important, this piece here. So part of when I see a lot of retrogrades or you have a retrograde chart, and I'll get into what that means, is you carry an expression or you're wanting to, your soul is wanting to dig deep to uncover your own unique expression that is typically going to be different than consensus reality. So what do I mean from that? I mean that looking at things from a bigger perspective, right? From a more collective consciousness perspective and the way things have been over the last couple thousands of years, we've been primarily conditioned by the patriarchal overlay, societal structuring, meaning that think of it from like an Aries perspective, and it's not, I'm just using this as an archetype, right? Aries, masculine energy, yang, going outward is me as an individual wants to have the power, right? So think of like land ownership and think of possession and control, think of religious conditioning, which then conditions society to believe that they're inherently flawed and they need to atone for sins and things of that nature, right? And so there's been this structural overlay of society. And so retrograde planets symbolize returning to who you are, right? Starting to understand who you are naturally, organically, right? And how to express that. That would be symbolic of retrograde planets, right? To say, maybe my soul in other lifetimes, or just the general times that we live in and how things have been conditioned, although we're switching them around now to the more feminine way of living. So look at your chart from that perspective. Any retrograde planets are returning to your origin, right? Who, from a soul perspective, how do you want to express yourself in the most unique way possible, which may go against other people, family, relatives, society, work environments, you name it, right? It could go against the beliefs of others, right? So the beliefs are ingrained in us from the past, right? From things that we've experienced in the past, shape our belief structures, which get passed on in further generations to say this is how we do things, right? And it's like, well, retrograde planet is like, well, I really want to return to who I am, and I want to release myself from any conditioning that is limiting the way I want to express myself. So look at it from that perspective. So oftentimes when I see heavy retrograde, and when I say heavy retrograde, I mean, so you have an ascendant, you have a sign on your ascendant in your natal chart, and there's a ruler of that ascendant, a planetary ruler. So if that planetary ruler, if you locate that in your chart and that planetary ruler is retrograde, that would lend to a retrograde personality, which means, yeah, the first house is how you project your energy. So I need to be able to do that in a way that's uniquely me, remove conditioning, right? And so that would be indicative of a retrograde personality chart. Also, if you have 3 or more planets in retrograde, that would lend to a retrograde personality. And so when I talk retrograde, I'm talking about the actual planets. You could look at your chart and see the north and the south nodes of the moon, which are calculated points. They're typically in retrograde, so those don't count. I'm just talking about Mercury through Pluto, all of the planets. If you see an RX symbol next to them and there's 3 or more, that's a retrograde personality. I'm not going to belabor the point here, but I have the other one here. Releasing any feeling of insecurity due to lack of social acceptance, right? So that plays into what I was just talking about, right? Is like, yeah, you're probably not going to fit in. So where there can be an experience of difficulty is the tendency to try to fit in, right? Like I keep bumping up against people or situations where I don't feel comfortable or I don't feel like there's harmony here. What's wrong with me? Right. So I have a retrograde planet. I have more than 3 planets in retrograde. I've had that a lot in my life where I'm like, I don't feel like I quite fit in. What's wrong with me? And it's like, no, there's actually nothing wrong with you. It's the universe's way of saying, not this way, or not this person, or not this environment. Come back to yourself. Come back. You have something unique that you want, that I need you to tap into to be able to express, right? And so stop bouncing into walls, or understand what the feedback is telling you, right? It's like, come back to yourself, come back. We need to keep you need to keep coming back to yourself to understand yourself in more depth so that you can be able to express yourself authentically. The other thing is that's a consideration is there's what's called an oblique retrograde, which means you could have, let's say you have Saturn retrograde and it's an exact opposition to Mercury, and your Mercury's not in retrograde. Mercury would be considered an oblique retrograde. And so what that means is that aspect between Mercury and Saturn, Mercury in relationship to Saturn would act in a retrograde type way, right? So just using that example, Saturn in retrograde is releasing yourself from conditioning. Like retrograde is societal structures, and it is conditioning, it is the container, it is your reality and the belief structures that are created. So if Mercury was opposing Saturn retrograde, mentally, my mind, Mercury, what I understand in this reality is going to change. It has a type of retrograde flavoring to it. Through this life experiences, I want to make up my own mind, release myself from any structures, and create my own thoughts that are supportive of my own unique expression, right? So that would be an oblique retrograde. And then I'll touch on this briefly. I'm probably going to do another video on this if you're familiar with progressions or not. But a progress chart is a way of looking at your chart where you would think of your natal chart, the time and place you were born. You took your first breath, your natal chart is created. If you take each day of your life and extrapolate that out per year, that would be indicative of changes in your psyche. So an example, you're born, I would take your chart in my software program and I would move it forward, let's say 35 days, right from the time you were born, and then look at the planets and the symbols that were in the chart 35 days after you were born. I can look at that when you're 35 years old and say, this is the changes within you when you're 35, right? As opposed to when you were born. So when you're 30 on your 35th birthday, looking at your chart, I can say, here's some of the changes in your psyche, right? If maybe some of especially the personal planets may change signs. And so your natal chart will always be the energetic imprint you're working through in this lifetime. The progress chart is just changes within your psyche, right? Like using an example, let's do like Mars is in Capricorn in your natal chart, right? So breaking free of structures from an EA perspective. And I look 35 days after you were born, and Mars has now gone into Aquarius. And so you'll always be a Mars in Capricorn. You're always going to want to break free from structures. But now when you're 35, since your Mars went into Aquarius, well, thinking outside of the box, creating new structures, right, that may be now supportive of your reality, right? So that's how it would be read. And so taking this to the retrograde perspective, it's a change in perception. So using that same example, so now maybe Mars moved from Capricorn to Aquarius, but it's in retrograde and it was direct in your natal chart. So retrograde means rethinking, reviewing, doing things different. And so if I saw like your Mars in Aquarius retrograde, I would go to your natal chart and say, give me all the Aquarius symbols. What house is Aquarius in? what planets are in Aquarius, where is Uranus, where is Saturn. I would look at all of those symbols and say, in these areas, you are going to need to express your individuality, right? That's what would be vibrating within you, so to speak, is you're going to be experiencing things and understanding things from a different perspective to break free of conditioning. And then the other direction, so let's say you had your Mars in Capricorn retrograde in your natal chart, and then I look 35 days after you were born and your Mars is in Aquarius, but it's now direct. That would be the other side of it. There'd be stabilization, right? So maybe with that Mars retrograde in the first 35 years of your life, you've had a lot of changes in terms of breaking free from structures. And now with Mars progressed in Aquarius going direct, there'd be some stabilization, right? You would have created some new structures that feel good for you. And so there won't be, there typically is not as much changes or as much upheaval as maybe you felt in the beginning of your life. And so that's how that works. And so now let's roll through each one of these symbols, right? So if you saw Mercury retrograde, if you have Mercury retrograde in your natal chart, so that happens about 3 to 4 times a year, and it's for the period of about 3 weeks, give or take, right? And so if you have that in your chart from an EA perspective, it means your soul has been collecting information in other lifetimes, right? It's collected a lot of data. Think of the Gemini archetype, think of the Virgo archetype, a lot of being of service, a lot of putting yourself in a lot of different situations, learning, understanding the reality, pulling different information from all different types of potentially environments and teachings and learnings. And so coming into this lifetime, there's the experience of I'm only going to be able to attach to the information that I need for this lifetime, right? Or I sat with somebody one time who had a Pluto in third house, which is very similar to a Mercury retrograde signature. And what he described to me, his experience of this is that yes, it resonated, but his experience was he can just learn stuff like that. Like he's like, I can pick up a book, I can read through it, I get it, right? Or being in school, he was an A student in school. He can just sit there and it was like, yep, got it. He's like, but my experience of it is yes, I can pick up a book or I can sit in school and I can learn stuff really quickly, but then it's gone. Like if you asked me a couple weeks later, I don't know. I'd have to go revisit it again and learn it again, right? So it was like he can quickly, it's like a soul remembrance of this information, right? Like he's being presented it. Oh yeah, I know that, right? So he just gets it and then moves on, right? So for him, it was like, yeah, I can quickly learn stuff, but then I don't need it and it's gone. Like I couldn't recite it to you. I couldn't tell you what it is. Only the stuff that he needs now he retains, right? So that was his experience of it. The other side of this, the way this can be experienced is having difficulty in schools, right? Like traditional settings, like a traditional school setting where a lot of times they teach you stuff you're not going to use in this lifetime. That would be difficult, right? It's difficult for anybody, but for a Mercury retrograde soul, they just learn differently. They're naturally going to navigate to the information that they need. So a lot of stuff being taught to them that they don't need, it's going to be really difficult for them to keep it, to learn it, right? Like think of, I'm going to teach you this information and I'm going to put a test in front of you like a month later or a couple weeks later. And so that Mercury retrograde individual might have difficulty taking tests because they're like, I don't need this stuff, right? So my soul is kind of washing it out. So it's really difficult. It could be difficult for you to do well on tests, right? And so I would say to somebody with a Mercury retrograde, don't worry about it. You're going to get the information that you need in this lifetime for your soul. It's okay. The other thing here is Mercury retrograde points towards Jupiter. So Jupiter is our intuition. It's our, I feel it and I know that this is the truth, right? Or you get information that isn't taught to you by another person. You just, I always use the analogy of jumping in your car and going to the grocery store and getting this download of information or this insight from something that happened in the past. And you're like, oh shit, I got it, right? Like that's the intuitive part of you. And so Mercury retrograde lends to the intuitive part. It's like you've been collecting information from realities in many lifetimes. This time you want the intuition to lead the way, the innate wisdom, the beyond the five senses type of wisdom. Then we move to Venus retrograde. So if you have Venus retrograde, this is a unique one because Venus retrograde, as compared to Mercury retrograde, Venus spends the least amount of time in retrograde of any of the planets. And so it's only every 18 months and it's for about 2 or 3 weeks, a 2 or 3 week period of time. So if you have this, cool, you're really retrograde, right? Um, and so this one is more self-reliance. It's more Taurus side. And what I mean by Taurus is Venus has a dual rulership. It rules Taurus. It also rules Libra. Libra is the more external representation of Venus. Relating to other people is a strong focal point. The Taurus side is my own values. What do I need to sustain my existence, right? What do I value and what do I surround myself with? And so it's typically seen in people that have a solitary life, like artists and musicians, or just simply somebody that pours themselves into something that they're hyper focused on that they feel is a soul calling, right? And so they pour themselves into it. And that is how they express themselves in this reality by going deep within and focusing on what their soul wants to express and expressing it. Could be social alienation, could be part of this because there's this, again, internal Taurus side, deeply internal focus to them. And so people, they may interact with people, they may be part of society. You wouldn't be able to potentially pick out a Venus retrograde soul, but there's an inner world to them that kind of gets separated from external reality. So if you think about people in relationship to you, you have people that are in your inner circle that you're around every day. Then you have people that are a little bit further out that are maybe like coworkers or friends that you spend a good amount of time with, but not as much as the people in your inner circle. Then you have like acquaintances and people that you see on occasion, and then strangers, right? There's kind of like this relationship circle, I like to see it as, right? And so Venus retrograde people may interact with people, but there's an inner world that a lot of people don't get to see, right? Or maybe one or two people, or maybe nobody gets to see the really inner workings of them or what they're feeling or what they want to express, right? The other thing here is attracting others who are independent or those who need counsel, right? So think of relationships here. There's a couple things with relationships. So Venus retrograde typically means you're going to return, like RX, replay relationships from past lifetimes. And so what I've seen here with some people that I've seen with Venus retrograde in their chart is always searching for the one, right? Like, and the reason why you're feeling that if you have Venus retrograde is because your soul agreement is to reunite with people that you've had other soul experiences with, right? So, yes, there is a longing within you of always searching for the one because you are searching for a soul that you're supposed to reconnect with in this lifetime. So, that's why you feel that way, right? That explains the underlying feeling. And so, what I would say to people here is recognize the feeling and know you're going to meet them, right? There isn't, it's going to happen naturally. There's going to be just a natural connection between the two of you because this is happening at a soul level, right? It's not trying to figure it out or, maybe it is getting on a dating app and you meet somebody, right? I'm not saying you're not taking action to find somebody. I'm just saying it's going to happen, right? You're going to connect with the people that you intend on reconnecting with. So there could be that feeling. And then back to this independence or people needing counsel. The independence part is, again, it's deeply internal, right? So there's going to be this buffer between you and most people because you do need to be internal and you only want to connect with people that you've had other experiences with. Or I won't say only want to connect with people you've had other soul experiences with. I would state it this way. I would say, those are important to you, right? There's work that needs to be done with those people. So they take precedence, right? So to speak. It's not that you won't ever meet somebody new that you haven't connected with and have a relationship with them. That's not the case. It's just from a soul perspective, there's importance in reuniting with the people you've already had experiences with, right? The other part of this is attracting people that need counsel, right? They would go to you as a Venus retrograde soul because you carry soul wisdom, right? You're very inward, you're very reflective. You can potentially help people understand themselves, go inside themselves and understand them, right? And so there could be a healing presence to your energy, right? Is to be able to bring people in and have that Venus nurturing, caring, it depends on what sign, the house, the aspects, and how you would express this, but being able to help other people in their own independence, right? Like maybe they've experienced being codependent, right? And you can help them individuate, right? Venus RX soul can help them individuate. So you could attract people to you that need counsel. So I would say in that respect, be to know this symbol, what it means for you, right? And then to be able to be aware of that so that when you do attract people, is this person here for counseling or are they here for something else, like a romantic relationship or to collaborate in some other way, right? So to kind of orient yourself or be aware of this so that when you have these experiences in relationships, you can orient them appropriately, where you may connect with somebody and you're attracted to them and they're attracted to you. It could even be sexually, but the sexual attraction may just be a bond that gets created so that you can counsel them, right? And it's not really for you to be happily ever after with them. It's for you to help them in some way, right? So to be aware of that is that I may attract people that need counseling. It may come across that it's a romantic relationship, but it may shift at some period of time when that person becomes independent or they become healed, right? So on to Mars retrograde. So Mars is every 2 years for about 2 month period of time. And so it's not retrograde very often either. So this would be a unique signature. But I was just watching something yesterday, I think, on YouTube. I think it was yesterday. Or no, I was reading something online and somebody had mentioned about Mars retrograde and they said that Michael Jordan had Mars retrograde. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty interesting, right? Somebody that is that talented having Mars retrograde is pretty cool. It's a good example of the signature. But anyway, from an EA perspective, it's more of so Mars retrograde is more of a Scorpio type orientation. And so if you think of just the symbol of Mars, Mars, the ruler of Aries, wants to take action, right? It's the lower octave of Pluto. And so think of it as I'm going to take certain actions that I feel are, I was going to say right for my soul, which is more Mars retrograde. Mars just takes action, right? So think of like the primal representation of Mars. I take action and then I get feedback, right? I'm acting as if I'm separate from source, right? If you think of the natal chart, like eighth house Scorpio energy is representative of like your soul, long term, not long term, but just like source energy, representative of source energy. The first house, Aries, Mars energy is the symbolism of I'm separating from source to have my own unique experience. Although you're never separated from source, you are source, right? And so Mars energy is I just take action, right? I'm expressing myself in a unique way, and then I get feedback from the environment. And so with a Mars retrograde soul, there's more of a where Mars can be like an unremediated response. It just goes, right? Like think of, punching somebody in the face or running or you name it, right? Any type of outward action that you can take with a Mars retrograde soul, they may do that, but there's more of then there's a reflection that goes on. That's like, well, why did I do that? What is the reason for it? Right. Which is Scorpio, which Scorpio is like, I want to understand this in depth. I want to understand why I'm doing it. Right. And so that's a Mars retrograde soul, is it's more, why did I do this? Right. Or if you do something and you get feedback that is like, oh, wow, well, I didn't expect that. Right. Or why did that person respond to me in that way? Or why did I have this experience? It's like reflection to understand what is that showing you about yourself. Right. So it's more, it turns the energy back inward quickly. Right. Mars retrograde is how I would describe it. The other thing that I said in the beginning too is I only want experiences that I feel are necessary for my soul to grow and evolve, right? And so as you progress, there's always a progression in these through your life experience. A Mars retrograde soul will start, it's almost like focusing their energy more towards, as their life progresses, a Mars retrograde will be more discerning in terms of how it uses its energy, right? And it's going to collect all of this data through experience, the Scorpio side of it, right? What did this mean for me? What's the deeper meaning from a psychological perspective? Maybe understanding metaphysical, understanding their multidimensionality, all of that stuff starts to take place within them, which then streamlines their energy. That says, I'm only going to involve myself in the things that I know feel good for me on a soul experience from a soul perspective, or actions that I feel I need to take to gain more wisdom, right? And so that would be the expression of this symbol. Mars is related to relationship and sexual energy, right? So this could also mean a fluctuation in sexual desire and instinct, right? There can be periods of time where it feels like you can't get enough. And there could be periods of time where you're like, stop, I'm not going, or for yourself, stop, I'm not going to express that energy during this period of time, right? So this can be seen as fluctuations in terms of how that energy is expressed. And just know by having this symbol that that's natural, right? To have that fluctuation. Continual elimination of anything not aligned with your soul's desires, right? And that again is just kind of like doubling down on the Scorpio energy. Why am I doing this? Why am I taking this action? What did I learn from that? And so that I don't repeat it, or I can close the loop on it, right? And then the other thing I put here is, for everybody, when Mars goes into retrograde, it's like soul renewal, right? It's like Mars returning to Pluto symbolically, like looking at it from an EA perspective, like Pluto being representative of like your soul's purpose or mission or self empowerment journey. When Mars goes retrograde, it's like soul renewal, right? So either Mars retrograde just in general, or Mars retrograde in progression, like I talked about progressions in the beginning, time of soul renewal. So think of this in your natal chart as Mars retrograde. Your soul expression is going to be really important with this symbol in your natal chart. Which brings us to Jupiter. So Jupiter goes retrograde every year for about 4 or 5 months, right? So it's pretty common that it's in retrograde. And so people born under Jupiter retrograde, releasing prior life belief structures. So what sign is it in? What house is it in? What aspects is it making to other planets? Will give you more context in terms of where you're releasing belief structures from past lives, right? So going back to in the beginning, when I talked about stepping back and looking at things from more of a societal structure and how things have been presented and how it's constructed our reality, this simply means, yeah, I'm going to, through this life experience, continue to release anything that no longer serves my own unique soul's expression, right? So that would be Jupiter retrograde. This also could be a heightened intuitive faculty, which means you get downloads of information, right? You get information and wisdom from other dimensions, higher dimensions, your higher self, universe, however you want to define that for yourself. You can feel truth, right? And maybe the experience here is just feeling things and knowing them and not really being able to express them in words, right? Linear language, Mercury type stuff, right? Gemini type stuff where I can express to you what I'm feeling. It's like, I know this is true. And somebody comes to you and says, how do you know it's true? And you're like, I feel it. I know it's true. I know it's truth. And so that could be the experience here too, is just knowing something is true without really being able to explain it. And then going back to the belief structure thing, there could be releasing the feelings of inferiority, right? So if you have Jupiter retrograde and you are a very creative, intuitive person that gains a lot of wisdom through just alone time or meditation or just through dream states or doing mundane tasks, and you can't explain a lot of it to people, that could be people saying, dismissing you, or that's not true, or what's wrong with you, right? And so there could be the experience of needing to release feelings of inferiority, right? To know you have the symbol in your chart, know that you do have the ability to get information that's not linear, that could come in pieces, right? That doesn't make much sense or that you can't articulate. That's part of your soul, right? That's part of your unique expression. And so releasing any judgments or any projections from people in terms of not conforming to consensus reality, which is still very much logic driven, right? A, B, C, 1 + 2 = 3, right? If you can't fit it in to that structure, you're outside of consensus. And that's okay, right? If you have Jupiter retrograde. And so the last bullet point here, identify and create distance from anything that isn't fully aligned with your knowing self, right? So if there's people around you in your environment or you're in environments where this part of you is not acknowledged or accepted, identify that first, right? And then start to shift that or start to shift your perception of what that means about you. It just means, yes, that they don't get it, right? They don't understand who you are, and that's okay, right? So you may need to acknowledge that and be okay with it, or remove yourself from those environments and surround yourself with people that do get you, right? Or that do understand that you are getting information that maybe is hard to articulate. Maybe you are friends with other people that have Jupiter retrograde, or just are very intuitive beings, right? Those type of people you would resonate with. And then we move to Saturn retrograde. And so this is, if you think of Saturn, stepping back, what is Saturn? Saturn is representative of the father or just the person in your environment that held the structure when you were younger, or the container that was held for you. It's also correlated to societal structures, and it's also correlated to belief systems, right? And so structured belief systems from the patriarchy and religious conditioning, and that type of structure, mental reality is part of Saturn. And so with a Saturn retrograde, it's defining your own reality that fits your individuality. So it's pointing towards Uranus. So in evolutionary astrology, Saturn is the structure that's formed for you to function in society or in your reality. Uranus is like continually breaking free from any structures that do not serve you, right? So if you have Saturn retrograde, yeah, going your own way, releasing from any Saturnian structures that aren't supportive of your own unique soul's expression. And as always, with all of these house sign aspects will provide clues on where this is going to take place or how, in what ways it's going to take place for you. Normally with a Saturn retrograde, because you're releasing yourself from structures, you will experience, or there's the potential to experience parental and societal structures that change over time. So maybe releasing yourself from the judgments or beliefs of your parents can be part of this. Releasing yourself from societal structures that you're part of. Maybe you believed there's a certain way that you need to do things in society, and so you've conformed to that for a certain period of time. And at a certain period of your life, that will transition. You'll be like, no, this structure does not support me anymore. I'm no longer going to be a part of it, right? So that's part of the life experience of a Saturn retrograde. The other things, repeating with parents from prior lifetimes, right? So you may be picking up with your parents again to repeat retrograde your experience with them. And so you're just picking up where you left off to continue the dynamics, right? And I'd say with a Saturn retrograde, it's experiencing maybe similar type dynamics, and then through your life experience, releasing from anything that is no longer you or is honoring of all of who you are. And again, this depends, right, on the soul's journey. Like maybe symbolically, this is your last Saturn retrograde, right? So you may be wrapping up with your parents, and maybe things are pretty harmonious, right, with your parents, and they do provide you with a good structure. And you've had lifetimes before where you've worked through a lot of stuff. So you would experience that as they are providing you a structure that caters to or is adequate for your own unique expression, Uranus, right? So that could be how you experience this placement. This could come off as introspective and reflective, right? It's the retrograde. It's going internal again, right? It's like, what are all of these experiences showing me? How can I create my own structure that feels good for me? Well, in order for me to do that, Saturn retrograde, I need to understand what my own structure is, right? What is my own expression, right? What do I want to express from within myself, which requires you to go inside to remove other people's influence at certain periods of your time, to go more internal, to be like, okay, I need a reset here. Like what is wanting to come through me that maybe hasn't been allowed to because I've been too close to other people that are projecting their own reality onto me, right? So I need to remove myself so that I can find my own unique expression. And so Jeffrey says in one of his talks about there's a natural brooding, right? Where you're just removed, you're in your own space. You maybe go out to the store, you do your daily routine, maybe you have a job and you kind of just tick the boxes there, but you come back and there's not really much social interaction, right? There's more of an internalness to you, right? And people may reflect that to you to be like, hey, why don't you come out and grab a drink? Or, hey, why don't you come to this party? And you're like, no, I'm good, right? I'm going to be in my own space, right? So that can be part of this signature in your chart as well. This could be seen as people close to you, or people close to you could see this as you withdrawing your energy. And it's like, yeah, you are. But what could happen is because you're withdrawing your energy, people close to you can be like, what's wrong with you, right? Or there's something wrong with you and you need to get help, right? They could start sending your way all different projections from their reality, which isn't really true. You actually do need the time to yourself. So knowing this, right, if you have Saturn retrograde, is to be able to state people that are close to you, hey, I do need some time to myself. And it's not anything that, how do I state this? So being able to communicate this to people close to you to say, like, hey, yeah, I'm going to need some time on my own. It's not saying anything about how I feel about you or how I value you. It just means I need to go internal sometimes. There's nothing else other than that. I do need some time on my own, right? And so that's something that could be the case here. And this next bullet point is along the same lines of that, which I already kind of covered that. It's like feeling like you're on an island, even though you're participating in maybe your job or society or groups or people close to you, you still feel there's this internal space, which is your own, right? Where you're keeping, there's actually an energetic boundary between you and other people from allowing them to get too close, because you do need a lot of space to go inside to understand what your own unique structure is. So that's what I just covered. Like there's this inner vibration which will keep people at a distance. So there's nothing wrong with you, and it doesn't say anything about you that you seem like you can't fit into groups or that you don't want to do things that other people want to do. It's actually part of your unique expression. Yes, you're supposed to remove yourself. You're supposed to have distance. The other thing here is could be children who are highly evolved. You could, if you do have children, you could have children that just know, right? Like think of people that are coming, or children that are being born that just get it, right? There's a lot more of them that are being born on this planet that have just innate knowledge within them, right? And so that could be a signal here. If you have Saturn retrograde and you have children, or you're going to have children, they could be highly evolved. They could have their own unique structure to them that is uniquely them, right? They just carry their own unique structure. The other thing here can be structural issues, right? If you think of Saturn, Saturn also correlates to your bodily structure. So your skeleton, what holds you up and in, right? Your actual physical structure. So if you're not honoring your Saturn retrograde, the feedback you'll get from your environment or from the universe is you'll start experiencing this as physical symptoms, right? Like, so things like arthritis or actual issues with your spine or your bone systems and your bone structures, right? You could have issues there. And if you do, that's feedback to say, hey, are you in environments, or are you denying your own soul essence in some form or fashion with the way you're living your life, right? That could be the underlying cause of these physical conditions. And then we arrive at Uranus retrograde. And so this is, again, every year, Uranus goes retrograde for about 5 months. So it's not uncommon. Like half the people born in a year, or a little less than half the people, will have Uranus retrograde in their chart, right? So it's rebellion. It's similar to Saturn retrograde, which is I'm going my own way, right? There's going to be a unique way that I need to express myself that may go against the environment that I'm born into or the people close to me. And it's like, well, why is that, right? It's like, well, everyone is unique, right? And don't they have to find their own path regardless of this sign in their chart? And it's like, yes, but a Uranus retrograde soul, that's part of their soul mission, is to be placed into or find themselves into a family structure or environments or groups and associations that can reflect to them what they are not, so that they can find their own unique path, right? If you think of this reality, it's a dualism which means compare and contrast, right? How do I know myself to be unless I'm in environments that show me who I'm not, right? And so that would be an expression of Uranus retrograde, right? Is like experiencing this reality in a way where your underlying soul is trying to discern its own unique expression by being put into situations, environments, and around people that reflect who you're not. Right. And so how does this get responded to? Well, it could be, I just like fitting in, so I'm going to deny my essence, right? Or it could be, I'm part of groups, but I have some unique opinions. And so I kind of walk the fence. I kind of give some of my opinions, but I don't give all of them because of the sense of belonging in this group feels good, right? So you're kind of splitting your energy. And then the other one is full Uranus retrograde, which is I'm doing me, right? I'm not going to subscribe to any people, any situations, any environments that do not support how I want to express myself, right? And maybe collecting or becoming friends with a small subset of people that think in the same way that you do and express in the same way that you do. Right. The other thing with Uranus retrograde is repeating relationships with friends, or I'd say people that you've contributed to society in some way, in some form or fashion in past lives, where you agreed to pick up where you left off. Right. Like I've had a couple discussions with an astrologer friend of mine where we're like, she said to me, she's like, I feel as astrologers, we've all kind of done this work before. This is kind of our soul's mission, or our, what we've done many, many lifetimes is to help guide the collective consciousness of the planet through the use of astrology symbolism and the language of astrology. And so a lot of times, us astrologers, we instantly bond with one another, right? And we connect with each other, and there's just a feeling of, I know you, right? We speak the same language, we know astrology, right? And so I have Uranus retrograde in my chart. A lot of people I know have Uranus retrograde in their chart. And it's like, there's that soul frequency of, oh, yeah, we're supposed to reconnect, right? We have some information that we need to share, right? And so that can be a signature of this as well. Just full Uranus, right? Strong mental activity that produces out of the box ideas. Uranus is the symbol of, it symbolizes electricity, it's tied to technology, it's tied to our electrical system, right? So we getting downloads, quick information that comes to us. Think of consciousness as being delivered through electricity, right? We're all energy, right? And so getting downloads of information, right? And so you may get these sparks or ideas that come and they're not fully formed and they keep coming in. And so what Jeffrey talked about was, if you continue to get these repeated signs or information that comes to you and they keep getting more frequent, and they keep happening more often, more often, and more often, those are the ideas to act upon, right? It's like your soul is saying, hey, it's time to bring this out, right? It's time for you to express this, right? And so if you have this in your chart, think about that and think about things that maybe keep coming to your awareness repeatedly, maybe through dream states or through your daily day, things keep popping into your awareness. Those are the ones that your soul's trying to get you to act on, to express in some way. The other thing with Uranus retrograde is it's a marker to process anything from past lives that's been traumatic, right? So anything, again, Uranus symbolizes your individuated soul and the experiences that it's had beyond this reality. And so anything, any kind of trauma, think of anything there that you experienced from an individuated soul level that produced trauma that you hadn't fully dealt with, right? Or think of having a traumatic experience that's so traumatizing that the normal response is to just suppress it, right? It's like, I'm not going to look at that. I'm just going to push it to the side and I'm going to go through, I'm going to go forward with my existence. Well, anything that gets repressed will come out distorted and it needs to be processed, right? It needs to be revisited. It needs to be understood for what it was. It needs to be looked at, processed, energetically cleared so that you can move forward. And so, Uranus retrograde soul, naturally throughout your life, there'll be a strong pull to maybe get hypnotized, like past life regression therapy, where you can go back into past experiences to recall them, to process them. It could come naturally, just spontaneously. You could have this weird memory that you just know is an experience, but it's not part of this timeline. And so it comes back to you and you're like, oh, what is that? Right. Or it could come through your dream state. You could have dreams that are really profound. Like I've had some of these where I woke up at like 2, 3, or 4 o'clock in the morning and my whole body is just like, whoa, that was impactful, right? That was a message for me, right? And so pay attention to those if you have Uranus retrograde. Just in general, pay attention to those if you get those. But certainly, if you have Uranus retrograde, it could be replaying some past life trauma so that you can understand the deeper meaning in it, be able to process it and transcend it. And so did I do a video? I thought I did a video on this. Yeah, when I talked about, what was the last one I did? It was about the why am I drawing a blank? It was a long video. It was like an hour and 30 minutes. Man, I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on this. It was the planetary method. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't the planetary method. It was the aspects, the planetary pairings, that one, that video that I just did. I talked about this a little bit about, actually, no, scratch that. It was the year I did a blog post on my website about Uranus and talked about, look at your if you have Uranus retrograde, look at the house sign and the aspects, especially the any squares or any oppositions to your Uranus placement. Do you have any disproportionate responses to people or situations or disassociations when it comes to those symbols? Right. So I used the example in my blog post of somebody I connected with, and he said that he, for most of his life, had a crippling fear of flying. He just would not do it. Like the thought of getting on an airplane and flying was just overwhelming. He happened to get a past life regression done, and he realized that he was a pilot in World War II and got shot down. Yes, so sure, getting on a plane would generate a fear that's not rational, right? And so once he understood that and recalled that in this past life regression, he was able to work through it, and he was able to understand that getting on a commercial airline in a non-war era was okay. He was safe. He was able to understand the context of the fear from the past life experience and then be able to work through it and understand that it's irrational, right? But he needed to go back to that point to process it to be able to move forward, right? So that's a good example here. The other last thing I have here is detachment from any emotional dynamics in relationships, right? So similar to Saturn retrograde, where there's parental stuff there, this can be a symbol of that too. Especially, I have Uranus and Scorpio. So Scorpio is the deeply merged energy area, right? So detachment from any emotional dynamics of relationships can be a Uranus and Scorpio, right? And so look at what sign Uranus is in and what house it's in, the aspects that it has, which will give you more information. And I believe, yeah, so Neptune and then Pluto. Neptune retrograde. So another one that happens yearly for about 5 to 6 months. So it's not uncommon. And so this one is this first line, I think, is kind of like sums it up. The desire to lead life through the crown chakra, living a spiritual life. And so look at the house sign aspects and we'll give you more context on how you will experience that. But that's one of the markers here of Neptune retrograde. And so think of Neptune, just the archetype of Neptune, as universal consciousness, right? Think of it as source energy or God or however you want to label that and what feels good for you, but it's beyond this reality, right? It's beyond this reality, but it is this reality, right? It's an expression of this reality, everything that we see, right? So it's being able to tap into the multidimensionality of who you are, be able to recognize that we're all connected, we're all one expression of source energy, and living life according to that, right? So that's one expression here of Neptune retrograde. The other thing with Neptune and what Pisces energy is disillusionment, right? Like, and so when I talk about disillusionment, it's like potentially getting lost in somebody's perspective, or it could be feeling one way about a certain situation, but then realizing that it shifts and it's not at all what you thought it was, right? Disillusionment, I kind of put in that category too, and I might have it here. I don't think I do. Escapism, the last point I have here. So I would say like that goes along with disillusionment is it's not quite the same. So disillusionment from the standpoint of, or I'd say escapism from the standpoint of it feels like this material reality, 3D reality, whatever your reality is too much. Like, so maybe you feel collective energies a lot and it becomes overwhelming to the point where you numb yourself, right? It's almost like trying to maintain that higher frequency state or being in a state that is not having to deal with the mundane things of this 3D reality. So think of alcoholism or drug use or things like that, or just consuming yourself with things that are escapist, things like sitting and playing video games for hours or TV watching or things like that, right? Can be part of this Neptune retrograde presentation. Really, Neptune in general, or a heavy 12th house too, but can be the case here with Neptune retrograde. The feeling of aloneness, right? Because it's associated with the 12th house, it's associated with Pisces, and so there's this removal, right? Can be part of this Neptune retrograde feeling where you kind of start backing up from things as you, if you think of Neptune as the higher octave of Venus in EA, right? So Neptune is universal consciousness. It's unconditional love, right? And so think of a lot of the presentations of this 3D reality that are not aligned with higher frequency expressions of energy, right? And so you find yourself backing up or needing to energetically disconnect from anything like that, right? Which is a lot of our reality, right? Things that are not authentic or things that are not done in a loving, caring way with other people. You need to back up, right? And be in your own space. The other thing here is vivid dream states, and I can attest to this. So I don't have Neptune retrograde in my natal chart, but in progression, it's gone into retrograde, and I think it's been there for most of my life. I think it went into retrograde when I was 10 years old, right? But I do have very good experience with Neptune. Neptune is in my first house, conjunct my north node. it's really depending on a house system, it's right on my ascendant. So it can either be in the 12th or the first house, but it's right on my ascendant. And so highly sensitive to collective energies and vivid dreams is part of that. Remembering past lives or getting messages and guidance for this life is definitely a marker of a Neptune retrograde, right? And I can attest to all of that right here. The vivid dreams, the deeply impactful soul level dream experiences, and getting messages and guidance from guides. I get that a lot. So, I mean, that's part of what I do is I sit here and I look at symbols and I channel messages, right? So I allow things to flow through me. The other thing here is trouble sleeping or needing much sleep, which is energetic overload, right? So a lot of people with Neptune retrograde in their natal chart, they've come from experiences, soul experiences, where there's been a lot of energy that they have consumed and that they've been a part of. And so they are just a natural antenna to energies, not just in this life, but other dimensions, to people around them, to universal consciousness. And so you could be just sitting on a chair, sitting in the corner, sitting in the park. You're still processing a lot of information, right? And so that can be trouble sleeping, right? Because there's so much energy going through you, or just needing to sleep all the time because it's just like, stop, there's too much energy. It's overload. I need a lot of sleep to regain my energy, right? And so that can be a marker of this too. The other thing is, we see labels in society as ADHD or autism, right? And we see a lot of that. And so ADHD and autism is a way of being for certain individuals that are not, they're not the typical, they don't fit into consensus reality and how we've constructed reality and how we feel people should operate, right? So when that happens, when people get born and are in this reality that are different, or they do things different, or they don't conform to how we normally do things in societal structures, they typically get labeled, right? It's like, well, you're this, right? So you're not, we have to accommodate for you because you're not fitting in the consensus reality. And really what's going on here is they're perfectly fine. They're expressing themselves the way that they are supposed to be expressing themselves, but because they don't fit into the structures in our society, we label them and we medicate them, and we say they have ADHD or they have autism, and we put them in a box, right, in a corner that says, well, you're different, right? And so if you have Neptune retrograde and you connect with ADHD or autism, or being labeled as that, or you identify with that, a Neptune retrograde soul, that could be the case, right? That you do present in a different way than society is normally constructed to fit you, so that you get labeled with this, with these labels, right? And so that can be part of this as well. The other thing is what you would label as genius capacity, channeling spirit, and astral travel, right? So if you're familiar with them, astral travel is, you can leave your body and go off, and your consciousness can experience other realities, right? So it's like detaching from this reality, and your consciousness goes off to have other experiences, to gain information, to understand different perspectives, maybe parallel existences where you're doing stuff in other locations too, right? And so that's astral travel. Channeling spirit, which is what I experience, is I see the symbols in the chart. That's kind of my language, and then I just kind of go off into this space where I just start spitting out information. That's kind of like what I'm doing now, right? And so that's part of this energy. And then genius capacity is just stuff will come to you that is beyond consensus reality thinking, right? So if you think of Neptune being the higher octave of Venus and being the symbol of universal energy and consciousness, think of yourself being in this body, experiencing this 5D reality, but then being able to grab information from other timelines, other realities and universal consciousness, right? And your guides and spirits. And so it would be labeled as consensus as genius capacity. Like, how did you know that? Or how can you provide this information without having learned that in school, right? Or learning it from somebody here, right? So it could be labeled as genius capacity, having these way out of the box ideas or ways of living that people can feel in their body as like, that's a yes, but I can't explain why, or I can't explain how you can explain that or do that or articulate that or exemplify that, you're a genius, right? So that's the label that would get put on. And then I already talked about escapism here, right? Um, so I put out a paraphrase here from JWG in one of his talks or in the school or in some of his material, right, where he talked a little bit about Neptune retrograde. And so I'll just read this here. In some Neptune retrograde souls, unresolved trauma and the associated hysteria will be present from birth. When this is the case, the brain's chemical composition will be in a state of imbalance. Various psychological effects will then be present within the consciousness of the Neptune retrograde soul. This will include irrational behavior, irrational, right? Like that's way out of the norm, linked with specific kinds of stimulus where the behavior being triggered is utterly disproportionate to the nature of the stimulus itself. Whatever the stimulus has the effect, whenever, I put that wrong, whatever the stimulus has the effect of igniting the reaction when the original trauma occurred, right? So I put that in there. I haven't personally experienced or had a session with people that experienced that, but that felt like something that I need to put in here. And so I have experienced, I just had a session with somebody where they're working with somebody that has a Neptune retrograde in their chart. And this statement kind of resonates with their experience of their reality, right? And so as I was doing this or as I was going to create this, I had this talk with this individual which made me keep this in here, right? So I'm like, this could be valid or it could help explain somebody's experience of this energy, right? So that's why I left that in here. And then on to Pluto retrograde, which is the last one I'll cover here, which it happens yearly for about 5.5 months. Not uncommon, a little less than half the people born in a year will have Pluto retrograde. And it simply means accelerated evolution. And how I would view this, I kind of pull from the Tom Jacobs teachings on this, which is like, you've been here before, which is the symbol of Pluto retrograde, meaning that where Pluto is in your chart by house sign aspects in the polarity house, right? It's like you've been here before, you've experienced this energy, you've wanted to become empowered in this area. And so in other lifetimes, your soul has experienced many different ways of trying to express itself uniquely and in the most authentic way in this area of your life. And so you're going to potentially most often in this lifetime, when I see Pluto retrograde, and I have this as well in my 10th house, which is doing this stuff, coming out in society, what's the best way for me to do it? It's like you're trying on many different ways of being. It's almost like you're looking at how other people do it and you're gathering bits and pieces from them and maybe stepping into certain ways of doing things for a period of time. But then it shifts because it's like, yeah, that's not quite how I want to express myself, or I wasn't seeing parts of myself. So I was putting myself in situations that didn't fit who I was, but I wasn't aware of it. But eventually I become conscious of it, which then shifts my reality. And then I remove myself from that environment. Right. And so there's most people will go through a good portion of their existence in this lifetime trying to figure it out. So what I would just say to people with Pluto retrograde is that's okay. That's part of your experience. So if you experience being frustrated with yourself or with things in general, it's like this offers some good perspective in terms of, yeah, that's part of what you mapped out, is to find your unique way. So can you view these experiences as gaining wisdom in terms of how to appropriately and in the most authentic way express your energy wherever Pluto is by house, sign, and aspect. And so that's all I've got. So hopefully, as always, hopefully, as always, as always, hopefully this was helpful for you. I appreciate your energy. I appreciate you being here. And I will be putting out, I'm sure, another video here shortly. Thanks so much. See you soon.